I hope you have your acid eye rinses ready for this one. Mine's out because I had to watch this movie like 3 times. So yeah, I went through a lot of eye acid. Now, I've been meaning to watch Tusk for a while, but even seeing just a trailer for it, I was just kind of like, maybe I'll wait on that. I'll put it off to a future day. Well, today's that future day because, yes, I've watched it, and like I said, I've watched it like 3 times for this video. And I'm someone who gets super irked out, creeped out by the uncanny valley spectrum of things. And this movie is uncanny valley to the max, to a T. This movie put me through it, and now I'm gonna put you through it too. We're gonna suffer together, the way that family should. But I'm telling you right now, this movie's all types of nasty and bizarre as hell. So get your acid eye rinses out and uncapped and at the ready, and let us begin unfolding the horror that is Tusk. The man of the hour, or soon-to-be walrus of the hour, is Wallace. Wallace is the main character, and Wallace has a podcast with his friend Teddy, where they pretty much scrounge up the most random, bizarre, humiliating videos on the internet. One video in particular is of a kid who's swinging and skill showing a katana, except the kid ends up accidentally chopping his leg off, which you would need a lot more powers than that to chop your whole leg off, but whatever. So because the video is horrible and stupid, Wallace loves it and loves making fun of the kid, and Teddy joins in, but it's predominantly Wallace who's being the asshole to everyone, all the time pretty much, in every episode of their podcast. But it seems that Wallace's humiliation of all the people in the videos they react to is what's really getting their podcast out there, because everyone loves that. The internet loves making fun of people, okay? Wallace and Teddy are in the US, and this kid is in Canada. And so Wallace, since he loved that video so much of, the kid chopping his leg off with a katana, he's like, it'd be so cool if I flew down to Canada and interviewed him about it. Okay. So Wallace does just that. He flies down to Canada, Teddy stays behind, so does Wallace's girlfriend. But once Wallace actually gets there to Manitoba, Canada, he shows up to a funeral. Because the kid that he had flown all the way to Canada to interview had just killed himself. So, Wallace being Wallace doesn't really care all too much. He cares more so about the fact that he just lost his podcast content, because, all for the podcast content, all for the content. So he's kind of like, oh yeah, the kid killed himself, whatever. Well, what am I gonna do for content? What am I gonna do for the next episode? So since he's pretty bummed about that, Wallace goes to a nearby bar, except in that bar's bathroom, he sees an advertisement that catches his interest. It's like a whole written page titled A Life of Adventure, and it's pretty much a retired war veteran who lives on his lonesome in a big woodland house, who is disabled, he's in a wheelchair, and he's pretty much just advertising for a room and board and a place to stay for someone if they come and help the vet out. Help him around his house because he is disabled. And in the advertisement, the vet also promises to have a myriad of fascinating life stories to share. So Wallace doesn't really care about helping him, or he's not interested in a room and board, but his attention hooks onto the part of interesting stories, because, he needs some new content for his podcast episode, because, the kid's obviously out of the deal. So Wallace contacts the man and gets his address and details, and the old man's name is Howe. Except he learns that this man is super far out in a place he's never even heard of, so he has to go into a nearby convenience store and ask the clerks, like, where the hell is this? Where the hell is this place? And even they're like, oh yeah, that's a solid 2 hours out. Boot. Because they're, in Canada. So Wallace, in his rental car, he travels all the way out to, to the boonies, to the back of nowhere, to get to this retired war veteran's isolated estate, truly in the middle of nowhere. That's never a promising sign, is it? But once Wallace arrives, they both sit for tea together and start talking, and the man starts going into his stories and whatnot, and Wallace is kind of upfront about the fact that, yeah, I'm not really here for room or board or to help you, I just want to hear your stories. I need podcast content. So the old man begins recounting his life of adventure, from meeting Ernest Hemingway in the war, all the way down to being shipwrecked at sea, and saved by a walrus, who rescued him from being lost at sea and brought him to this tiny little island, where they both lived together for some time. And the more the man talks about his rescue story with the walrus, you can tell he's very infatuated with walruses and has a great respect for the noble creatures. And Howard says that after the walrus saved him from drowning out at sea when he was stranded, they began a deep, meaningful relationship together on that island. And he said he's had no better friends since. And he, quote, never had such a fulfilling friendship with anyone. And apparently he affectionately named his past walrus Mr. Tusk. But as Howard is rambling on and on about the majesty of walruses and how Mr. Tusk was his best friend, whatever, Wallace starts feeling a little woozy. And the room starts kind of shifting around Wallace, and he starts slowly passing out. And then Wallace just wakes up the next day, except now he's in a wheelchair, and Howard is sitting across from him in his own wheelchair, kind of just waiting for him to wake up. Of course, Wallace is super confused and still hella woozy and kind of out of it, only to look down and realize that his left leg has been amputated, like at the knee, below the knee. This is why you don't go to any deserted, isolated houses out in the middle of nowhere. They always contain freaks. Always. Also, in honor of this movie, I'm wearing fish earrings. Fish in a bag earrings. So Wallace, realizing that he's missing his left leg now, is obviously starting to freak out about it. I mean, as much as he can, he's still kind of drugged. But Howard starts explaining himself, like, oh yeah, yesterday you were bitten by a brown recluse. It was terrible, this and this. It bit your leg, and we had to have a doctor come over and amputate it. It just could not be saved. And Wallace wants to talk to the doctor, but Dr. Mosier, if he even exists, has left already. He needed to go and do his rounds and help other people. And also, coincidentally, Dr. Mosier, who was here last night, amputating Wallace's leg, also accidentally stepped on Wallace's phone and broke it. Suspicious all round. So Wallace has no way of getting out of there, and no way of contacting anyone, and Howard Howe is over there playing it cool. Oh, just a little spider bite, it's nothing, it's a little scratch, 'tis but a scratch. Yes, you're missing your leg, but it's just a scratch. And understandably, Wallace is starting to freak the hell out. Now he's trapped, and something more sinister is slowly unfolding before him. And that night, Howard just has Wallace sat at the end of a massive table. He's at the other one, casually eating dinner, except Wallace can't even move his arms, because whatever sedative or whatever it is that Howard gave him is like paralyzed him. So Wallace is sitting there, freaking the hell out, but not being able to do anything about it. And he knows something bad's coming. He knows. Except the whole time, Howard is still clinging to that spider facade. Oh yeah, definitely was a spider. But by this point, Wallace is pretty damn sure there was no spider, and that Howard is actually insane. But now he's stuck there, so what can he do about it? But the one thing he can do about it is scream. So he's sitting at the other end of the table to Howard, and he's just screaming at him to let him go, and you're psycho, this and this, like, get me out of here! So Howard gets up out of his seat, walks over to Wallace, without his wheelchair, and then, like, I think slaps him in the face. Get a hold of yourself! And after slapping Wallace, Howard calmly goes back to his seat, sits down, so he can walk, apparently, as if everything else wasn't fake about him. And he just as calmly explains that he has created a walrus suit, and continues to go on about his bizarre fixation to walruses, his love for them, his adoration for walruses, and he says he wants to find out if man is really walrus at heart. Afterwards, Wallace is left alone in the front room, in his wheelchair, because he's wheelchair bound now, but then he starts hearing the ringtone to his phone. So he knows the phone's not broken, and he scrambles around the front room trying to find it, and he just misses the call. And the call is from his girlfriend, Allie, who stayed back in the States, and he frantically tries to call her back, but she doesn't answer, so he leaves her an urgent voice message saying, I've been abducted by a psycho, he's cut my leg off, and he wants to turn me into a walrus, help! He also tries to call Teddy, who is his podcaster buddy, who's also back in the States with Allie. Teddy doesn't pick up either, so he leaves a similarly panicked message for him. In the morning, when Wallace's girlfriend, Allie, awakes, in the same bed with Teddy, his podcaster friend, she goes to her phone in the bathroom and sees that she has missed calls from Wallace. So yeah, Wallace's girlfriend, Allie, and his friend Teddy are cheating together. But to be fair, okay, Wallace is an asshole. He treats Allie like crap, and as super disposable and expendable. He's even voiced to Teddy that he wants to cheat on her. Anyway, since Allie and Teddy are together, they both hear the voice messages and realize they're on both their phones. And then they start freaking out because they're hearing that Wallace has been abducted and had his leg cut off, and also that he might be getting turned into a walrus. So Allie and Teddy try to call Wallace back, but Wallace is a little busy at the moment. Because back at Howard Howe's manor house, while Howard is monologuing his tragic past or past sob story, he's actively performing walrus surgery or walrusing surgery on Wallace's unconscious body. Both Wallace's legs have been amputated at the knee, his arms have been sewn to his sides, like half of his arms, so he can kind of wave his forearms, and his tongue has been cut out. Meanwhile, Allie and Teddy are alerting the police over the alarming voicemails they receive from Wallace as they travel over to Manitoba themselves. Back at the Howard homestead, Howard is finishing suiting Wallace up in the walrus suit, which is made from the flesh of other human beings, probably his past victims or something. And Wallace, who is now awake and probably in terrible pain, is emitting these haunting, horrific screeches. These bellowing screams, but he can't speak because his tongue's been cut out. Or cut out. And now that Wallace is all finished and suited up, Howard starts talking to him like he's actually the old Mr. Tusk. He even says, like, how I've missed you, Mr. Tusk, and reminiscing on their old times together on that little island. So Teddy and Allie have made their way over to Manitoba, Canada by now, and they're bringing their concerns to the police there, and the voicemails as well. And the police officer, after hearing in the voicemail that Wallace's leg has been cut off, he thinks of a similar case. Or someone comes to mind who's invested in similar cases to this. The police officer tells him that there's a former detective who has been looking into cases where the dead bodies have been turning up without legs and a bunch of other modifications done to them. So the officer gives them his number, thinking that maybe he can help them and help them find Wallace, since this former detective guy is very much into this kind of case. He's very much dedicated his life into these type of cases, because apparently there's been a lot of them. Apparently there have been a lot of dead bodies showing up, mutilated and missing their legs. And the former detective the officer directs them to is Guy Lapointe, aka Johnny Depp. And since he's been retired, he's been on the hunt for this Canadian serial killer, who has a very specific MO, i.e. the missing legs. So Teddy and Allie meet up with Guy Lapointe, and they start trying to look into it with him, but he's a little off, he's a little eccentric. He's missing a few bolts, but he seems like their guy. He seems like the guy who can help them find Wallace. Speaking of Wallace, back at Howard's homestead, woo! Howard is forcing Wallace the walrus to swim, even though he obviously does not have the anatomical structure to swim. So he has this pulley system and a chain around Wallace's tail, and he drags Wallace into the water. And so Wallace is like fighting and treading and trying to stay afloat, but he obviously is not built to swim like that. So he starts sinking, and at that point he probably just wants to give up and just drown and get this over with. But as Wallace is sinking to the bottom of his pretty deep tank, he sees through the glass into another tank that there is another walrus-human hybrid corpse rotting at the bottom of the tank. So obviously one of Howard's last victims, who couldn't tread water and couldn't stay afloat and just sank and drowned. So this obviously starts freaking Wallace the hell out. So he scrambles and claws and fights his way back to the surface, and Howard Howe is like, "Wow, look at you, Mr. Tusk, swimming once again." So Allie and Teddy are meeting up with the eccentric but well-meaning Guy Lapointe, who said he's been hunting for Howard Howe for the last decade, and Guy Lapointe says that in the meantime he's sacrificed many marriages and lots of sanity. Because Guy Lapointe is obsessed with finding him. He's determined. Guy reveals that, at least so far as they know, Howard Howe has had 23 victims, and the MO has remained the same each time. The person's body is found a month after they initially go missing, with both legs amputated at the knee, arms sewn to the side, tongue cut out, and 2 mysterious holes cut in or barbed into the top of their jaw. I wonder what those could be for. But he says in one of the past victims, they actually found parts of the victim's tibia bone left over in the hole. And if you didn't know, tibia is like the shin bone, or along the shin bone. So in other words, it's always the part of the leg that goes missing with the victims. But you and I, we know what those holes are for, and yes, after Howard cuts their legs off, he shaves their tibia bones down into tusks. So those are the bones Wallace has screwed into his mouth. Who thought of this movie? Who thought of this movie? So back to Wallace and Howard. Howard is kind of leaning on and stroking and bonding with Walrus Wallace, or Mr. Tusk to him. Wallace does not exist anymore, it's only Mr. Tusk. But after he's been leaning on Mr. Tusk and spewing his typical misanthropic vitriol, he brings Wallace out a fish to eat. "Oh, you must be starving, Mr. Tusk. Here you go." And I guess Wallace is starving because he actually does eat it, and this very much pleases Howard Howe. He loves that. He loves that Wallace is embodying that new walrus facade, the new walrus persona. After a bunch of top-notch detective work from Guy Lapointe, they actually do discover Howard Howe's actual address, and they discover it from a notepad at the convenience store where Wallace had previously been. They kind of pull out the old pencil shading trick, and back at Howard's madhouse, Howard is kind of dragging Wallace along and wading him in the water with him while talking to him. But as he's wading Wallace around and helping him swim a bit, this is where Howard reveals that after having stayed on that tiny island with Mr. Tusk for a while, after Mr. Tusk had pulled him from the water and saved him from drowning, brought him to that tiny island, and they lived there together for a while, Howard actually ended up killing and eating Mr. Tusk because, he was sick starving. Except he ended up killing and eating Mr. Tusk right before he was saved. Like, he was still munching down on Mr. Tusk's, flipper or something as a rescue boat came. So if he had waited another 5 minutes, he could have not killed his best buddy, Mr. Tusk. And maybe Howard wouldn't have turned out as crazy because he was just so overcome with guilt and regret. I guess so much so that he has to turn other people into Mr. Tusk to revive him and bring him back. But Allie, Teddy, and Guy Lapointe are hot on Wallace's trail. They just found his abandoned rental car dumped in a nearby lake. So they're getting closer. Finally. But back with Howard and Wallace, Howard has gotten into his own form, a walrus suit. Obviously, not surgically, just just like a costume. He's just put it on because he wants to give Mr. Tusk a fair chance at fighting him, since Howard had murdered the original Mr. Tusk to eat him. So he wants to give this Mr. Tusk a fair chance to fight him, walrus to walrus, mano a mano. So Walrus starts bellowing and shrieking like in his creepy fashion. Ew. That noise has been locked into my brain ever since I've watched it. Ew. But then they start brawling, like walruses. Since Wallace is shrieking so much as him and Howard are fighting, the three of them, Allie, Teddy, and Guy, who are really hot in his trail, they hear the distant screams, so they know they're in the right place. They know they're in the right direction. And then they all rush their way over to the manor house. Howard cheats by getting out of the walrus suit, because he's like, well, you've acclimated to being a walrus so much, Wallace, it's not fair if I'm a walrus as well, because I haven't acclimated yet. So Howard gets out of the walrus suit and starts beating on Wallace, who's obviously still a walrus and can't just slip out of that little suit. Except Wallace overpowers him by stabbing his tusk into Howard's foot, and then when Howard falls over because of that, Wallace kind of scrambles up onto his chest and starts stabbing his chest with the tusks. It makes for a very fascinating scene, if you will, if that's the word you want to use. But even as Howard is actively dying, that psycho is like, yes, you've embraced walrusism. You've become the walrus. You are Mr. Tusk. And then he dies. Thank goodness. Right then, Allie and Teddy burst into the walrus room, the aquarium kind of space, to see Wallace shrieking and bellowing and thrashing about with blood all over his face and just kind of psychotic. So Allie and Teddy are both weirded the hell out and they don't know how to react. And then Guy Lapointe follows in the room after them and he sees the current state of Wallace and how far gone he is, even though it's been like, 3 days? So Guy Lapointe aims his gun at Wallace to kind of, I guess put him out of his misery, even though they could just as easily take him out of the suit. I understand he underwent some surgical stuff, but at the very least you could give him his human form back to an extent, right? But as Guy's about to shoot him and put him out of his misery, Allie stops him. I guess she still has feelings for Wallace. And then it jumps to 1 year later, and Allie and Teddy pull up to a zoo. You see where this is going? Allie and Teddy arrive at a zoo, and they go over to this isolated enclosure, this kind of small pen with a kind of an igloo thing and a pool. And they're both kind of like on the overlook looking into the pen. And Allie calls out for Wallace, like, Wallace, we're here! Wallace! And then Allie throws him down a fish. So Wallace, still in his walrus form, even a year later, shuffles his way out of the igloo or shelter. And he's tearing this mackerel to bits. And he's fully embraced his animal side. And Allie's kind of just like, Wallace, like, do you remember me? Do you remember us, Wallace? And he kind of just looks up at her and there's not a lot of thought going on behind those walrus eyes. Both Allie and Teddy are sad and a little grossed out, and Allie tells Wallace that she loves them before they both turn to leave. And then Wallace, with all like the fish guts all over his face, he watches them leave and then tears start pouring down his walrus eyes, down his walrus face. And then he slowly and sadly slinks back into his shelter. Because maybe he's still more human than he seems. I think we need a bit of a psych evaluation on the person who created this film, and everyone who worked on it, okay? This movie was like a bad trip, I don't know. But the thing that saves it from being completely horrific and horrible and scarring is that it very much elbows into the comedic side of things, so it kind of has that comic relief throughout. So it more so presents itself as stupid and unserious than dark and macabre and horrifying, which if you just watch movie clips from it, you really won't get that vibe. You gotta watch it full context, if you dare. Also, the ending makes no sense whatsoever. Yeah, I know Wallace is missing his legs, okay? And I know his arms have been sewn to his sides and his tongue's been cut out. You can still transform him back to human. You can still take him out of the walrus suit, unsuture his arms, I guess, cut his arms back to how they were. Sure, he'll be disabled in a wheelchair, and I don't know what you do for the tongue, but you can revert him back to humanism. Why would you just surrender him to being a walrus and like, oh, well, it's too late now, let's just put him in a zoo. Also, what zoo would take a walrus-human hybrid like that without calling the police? The ending is so brain dead. It's so stupid. But again, the movie does not take itself too seriously, so maybe I wanted to play into that stupidity with that ending, but just change him back! As much as you can, change him back! But this movie was actually more entertaining than I anticipated it was going to be, and it was a little less horrific than I thought going in. Because from the clips I saw, it seemed like a doozy. Because I'm not a huge fan of body horror, or especially gratuitous body horror, and especially when it's to innocent people. If it's like actual evil people being tortured and all the body horror is being taken out on them, that's something else, but which is pretty much why I don't ever foresee myself watching The Human Centipede. I don't think I could stomach that. But Tusk was more doable. Somehow. Somehow I got through. 3 times. 3 times. 3 times too damn many.